Hello and welcome to the hashtag Make Procurement Awesome with SAP Ariba podcast series. Please welcome our guest, Dan Georgescu. Dan is with the Working Capital and Operational Restructuring Organization at PWC Middle East. Dan has been a guest to the podcast before with his extensive supply chain and working capital experience. So Dan, what is supply chain finance?
Hi Derek, thanks for the intro and good to be back on the podcast. So around supply chain finance is known as many things, to be honest, but the most common one is reverse factoring. It's a relatively new way of providing liquidity to a business and at the same time improving working capital throughout the supply chain. To give a bit of an overview, there are typically around 3 to 4 parties involved in a supply chain finance program: the buyer, the supplier, a technology provider, and a lender or a financial institution. And sometimes you could have the lender or the financial institution and the technology provider being one and the same entity. It's not actually uncommon. Under the supply chain finance facility, suppliers will sell their invoices or receivables at a discount to the financial providers. In return, the supplier will get kind of faster access to the money they are owed, and that's only if they choose to. They might not choose to sell some of their invoices throughout the year. So they actually get flexibility to access cash when and as they need it the most. For the buyers, they usually seek to extend payment terms under the supply chain finance principles, either by negotiating with a financial institution or directly with the supplier. And finally, I think is a quite key point here that the supply chain finance is actually based on the creditworthiness of the buyer and not the supplier. So it would be favorable for a supplier to get access to cheaper financing in some instances.
What are the benefits of supply chain finance?
The nice thing about it is that all parties have their benefits. Some of the general ones being freeing up trapped liquidity for the supplier and allowing for better financing at lower cost. It's providing an instrument for negotiating better trade terms with suppliers at no cost to itself. It's increasing transparency in the supply chain. It's helping improve buyer-supplier relations. It's providing an opportunity to fully automate procurement and accounts payable processes. It's helping manage the credit risk in the supply chain, or it's just simply enabling a more straightforward reconciliation of payments with invoices. If I would be to pick up on a few of the points I mentioned earlier around the improving of relationships, increasing transparency, or just general managing risk in the supply chain, they're all kind of steered towards direct spend suppliers, where one would want to put the focus on and build on those relationships. To give some examples of the cash or monetary value of the benefits for the different parties, I'll use an example of $1 billion annual spend and a contractual term of 30 days between the buyer and supplier. The buyer could extend terms, for example, and free up circa $82 million for a 30-day extension. On the other end, the supplier could collect the cash quicker, hence reduce its DSO. This would free up around $27 million for each 10 days of reduction in the DSO. So that is a lot of cash across the supply chain that could be freed up by using a supply chain finance program.
That's great. So mutually beneficial to both parties involved.
Indeed.
What suppliers are the ideal target for supply chain finance?
As always, the answer is it depends. And this time it depends on what the end goal of the buyer is. But in my view, the ideal relationship would be between a larger buyer and a smaller supplier, where the suppliers could access cheaper financing based on the creditworthiness of the buyer. Ideal targets would be key suppliers where relationships are either already good, but on the contrary, it could be with suppliers where somebody would seek to improve those relationships. On the latter one, a supply chain finance program will help enhance that communication, minimize the risk with that new supplier, and overall just help strengthen that relationship. I would also prioritize direct spend suppliers over indirect spend suppliers, just due to the transactions volume and the frequency of those transactions. And also at the end, it's worth mentioning that suppliers which are monopolistic or due to the nature of the product that they're selling are really strategic ones. They are usually not inclined to enter in such a program initiated by the buyer due to the leverage that they have in that relationship.
So taking that a step further, is there any rationale where supply chain finance would make more sense for direct suppliers?
Yes, besides all the reasons kind of stated already, in my opinion, when looking at the supplier base, more often than not, direct suppliers are the ones representing the highest risk to the overall supply chain. So in order to minimize that risk of disruption, one would ideally want to create an environment when transparency is increased, processes are automated, cash forecasting is facilitated, and both parties walk away from the table as winners at the end of the day. So supply chain finance provides all these and more. Hence, for both new and old direct spend suppliers, this could really work very well by either strengthening an already mature relation or just accelerating the growth of that relationship. Plus, the buyer setting up a supply chain finance program and onboarding suppliers, it comes with a cost, obviously, and from a commercial perspective, you wouldn't want to onboard indirect suppliers where you maybe have one or two or random number of infrequent POs during the year.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Well, that concludes our podcast session on ideal partners for supply chain finance. I'd like to thank Dan and PWC for joining us today. For more information on PWC and their working capital solutions, please visit pwc.com. For more detailed information on Ariba and how we can help you implement supply chain finance, please refer to ariba.com and our iTunes page.